Hey guys, tonight we step into muddy boots and silk gloves, trailing the unmistakable scent of citrus and rosemary through cannon smoke and powdered wigs. You're marching alongside a man who believes victory starts not with strategy or steel, but with a splash of cologne behind each ear. Yes, seriously, the battlefield reeks of sweat, iron, and Italian perfume. And somehow, that perfume matters. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and the current time in the comments. Let's see who else can't sleep tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a soldier in Napoleon Bonaparte's Grande Armée, and you already know your general's daily routine better than your own. Why? Because his habits shape the rhythm of war itself. While your comrades clean rifles and polish boots, Napoleon does something less expected. He opens a slender glass vial filled with 4,711 eau de Cologne, a German-made fragrance packed with citrus, herbs, and a whiff of overconfidence. He doesn't dab, he pours. Gallons of the stuff, rubbed onto his chest, temples, hands, any skin not currently occupied by medals or buttons. You can smell him before you see him, a walking lemon grove in the middle of the Alps. And here's the kicker, he's not alone. You and the rest of the officer corps are starting to carry your own tiny vials. Some of you even write home begging for more. Forget gunpowder, you're rationing scent. Why cologne? Well, Napoleon swears it keeps him sharp. The refreshing smell clears his mind, wakes him up faster than coffee, which, by the way, he also drinks obsessively, and makes him feel clean, even when marching for days without bathing. Because let's be real, you're not showering in the middle of Russia. Historians still argue whether this obsession was more about hygiene, habit, or sheer superstition. Some claim he believed the scent protected him from illness, like those plague doctors with their beaked masks stuffed with herbs. Others suggest he was simply hooked, like addicted. He reportedly went through 2 bottles a day. That's not a touch of luxury, that's a lifestyle. And here's a fringe tidbit. Some say Napoleon believed the scent could mask fear. Not just his, but the army's collective dread before battle. The idea was that if you smelled like you just stepped out of an 18th century spa, you couldn't possibly be afraid. Try telling that to your bladder when cannonballs start flying. Of course, that logic doesn't hold up under fire. But Napoleon was never really about logic. He was about control. And Cologne, that was something he could control, amid chaotic battlefields, flammable politics, and traitorous allies. He could at least smell the same every day. It was a tiny, fragrant island of certainty in a sea of mess. You remember that skirmish outside Ulm? Cold, misty dawn, your hands numb on the musket, and there he was, striding past your line like a man headed for the opera, not a siege. The scent hit first, citrus, lavender, clove, and then the voice, clipped, confident, barking out orders like he could command the weather. A few soldiers snickered behind their scarves. But you felt steadier somehow, like if he wasn't afraid, maybe you didn't have to be either. Now, let's not pretend this Cologne thing was just about bravado. There were practical benefits. Marching with a bunch of unwashed men and horses in summer. Cologne becomes a social survival tool. You take any excuse to unstopper a vial, sniff deep, and pretend your boots weren't full of swamp water. And Napoleon didn't just wear the cologne, he practically endorsed it like a proto-Instagram influencer. He gave bottles to friends, gifted them to generals, even shipped them to family members across Europe. A bottle of eau de Cologne became shorthand for favour, proximity to power. You didn't just smell good, you smelled important, which is kind of hilarious when you remember this man was born on a minor Mediterranean island and once got bullied for speaking French with a Corsican accent. Yet here he was, redefining masculinity and leadership one fragrant cloud at a time. So, you carry your own little flask now, nestled in the side pocket of your tattered coat. You open it on long marches during endless waits before a charge, when the lice itch too much and the bread tastes like sadness. The scent doesn't solve anything, but it does something. And when the cannon roars and the chaos begins, when horses scream and banners fall, and you lose track of where you even are, that smell might be the only anchor you have left. A reminder that somewhere in this nightmare, there's still a part of you that's human, dignified, even. You tuck the vial back inside your coat, let the last trace of citrus linger on your wrist, and prepare to march. The scent fades behind you, just slightly, but not entirely. You wake before the frost melts, your tent canvas stiff with cold and yesterday's breath. Your boots go on with a crunch, frozen solid, like everything else in this forsaken field. And yet, beneath the grunts and clinks of waking soldiers, there's that odd scent again. Rosemary, bergamot, maybe a whisper of neroli. Napoleon's up. He's already dressed, already moving, already smelling like victory, or at least like a luxury soap ad in a war zone. And today, like every other day, he's wearing silk. You glance down at your own threadbare wool and crusty overcoat. Now imagine sliding into a cool, slippery silk undershirt every morning. That's what your emperor does. And no, it's not for vanity. Well, not just vanity. Napoleon believed silk kept him safe. Not metaphorically, literally safe. The idea was that silk, with its tight weave and slippery surface, could deflect blades and absorb the impact of a bullet, just enough to keep a wound from being fatal. It's not totally crazy. Some Mongol warriors centuries earlier lined their armour with silk to help arrows glide rather than pierce. But it's still the 1800s, and you can't help but feel like your boss is gambling on fashion over physics. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's silk obsession was born from practicality, superstition, or a lifelong fear of surprise assassinations. There's evidence of all three. The man lived like every shadow held a dagger, and let's be fair, some of them did. And it wasn't just the silk. You've seen his gloves. Soft buttered leather, scented faintly with violet. Some say he rubbed lavender into them before slipping them on. Others claim he paid extra for perfume linings. It sounds indulgent until you've marched through a battlefield where the stench of blood, horses, and rot gets in everything. Suddenly, perfumed gloves seem less like a luxury and more like a coping mechanism. One of the stranger stories comes from his valet, Constant. Supposedly, Napoleon would change gloves several times a day, not because they were dirty, but because he didn't like how they felt once they'd warmed up. You, meanwhile, are lucky to have gloves at all. Yours are patched with old blanket scraps and maybe a bit of someone else's boot leather. But here's the funny thing. You don't resent him for it. Not really. In a way, it's comforting that he's still this particular, even while marching through freezing mud to conquer another kingdom. It makes him seem unshakable, even when the weather, the food, and morale are all collapsing. Fringe fact incoming. There's a rumour that Napoleon had one silk shirt that he called his lucky shirt, and only wore it into major battles. No proof, of course, but you start watching closely every time he changes. Is that the shirt? Is that the one from Austerlitz? He notices you watching one morning. He raises an eyebrow, then smirks. A general must be comfortable in discomfort, no? He says, smoothing his collar. And speaking of collars, oh, the collar's tall, starched, pristine. No matter the mud, the blood, or the miles, Napoleon's collar always seems untouched. Crisp enough to slice bread. You try that once. 3 seconds later, your entire neck's chafing like you lost a fight with a cheese grater. Still, the look grows on you. You find yourself adjusting your scarf a little tighter, straightening your buttons, cleaning your boots a bit more thoroughly when the weather allows. If the boss can parade around like a fashion plate in a war zone, maybe you can at least not look like a swamp creature. And then one day, you catch yourself wishing you had a spare silk shirt, not for vanity, for ritual, for control. You see, every soldier clings to something, a necklace, a folded letter, a lucky sock. You've got one guy who swears he can't aim straight unless he eats a prune before loading his musket. These aren't battlefield strategies, they're emotional armour. And for Napoleon, silk is part of the armour. He believes he's chosen, destined. And if that destiny happens to involve high-quality fabric, say scented gloves and monogrammed boot trees, well, so be it. Historians like to argue whether his style was all performance, meant to awe, to intimidate, to brand him as more than mortal, or if it was sincere. But from where you're standing, as frost crunches underfoot and the distant sound of cannon fire echoes across a grey field, it doesn't really matter, because it works. The men follow him, the officers emulate him. And you? You just found a torn silk handkerchief in the wreckage of an abandoned noble's home. You don't know why, but you keep it, fold it neatly, tuck it into your pack like it might matter. And in the morning, when you wake again to frozen boots and the smell of cologne cutting through smoke, you press the silk to your face. Cool, soft where clean. Just for a second you feel less like a tool in a war machine, and more like a person. You check your coat pocket for the third time in 5 minutes. It's still there, your brass pocket watch, ticking away like a nervous heartbeat. It's one of the only things you own that's remotely shiny anymore, and it's not even yours. It's regulation issue, handed out by Napoleon's quartermasters with unusual urgency, as if accurate timekeeping might somehow win battles. You're not the only one watching the clock. Everyone's got a timepiece now, from stable boys to field marshals. Not because the French army suddenly turned into a punctual parade of gentlemen, but because Napoleon demanded it. This man's obsession with time is the stuff of legend. He doesn't just want to know what time it is, he wants to control time itself. He famously planned battles to the minute, breaking down marches, meals, and manoeuvres with a level of detail that would make your high school band director weep. Historians still argue whether this obsession was a tactical brilliance or a compulsive need to micromanage everything. Maybe both. After all, he once wrote that the loss of even a quarter hour could decide the fate of an empire, which sounds dramatic until you realize he actually meant it. You remember that day before Jena? The night before, Napoleon sat, huddled in his tent, 3 watches laid out before him like tarot cards. His aides de camp were half asleep, but not him. He was checking time zones, sunrise predictions, and river tide schedules like some deranged calendar wizard. And you were trying to figure out why your boots smelled like cheese. Anyway, back to the watches. Napoleon didn't just carry one, he carried several. Some accounts say up to 10 at once, each set to different local times for the regions he was managing. He wore them across his body, tucked into waistcoat pockets, coat linings, even boots on occasion. You once joked to a fellow soldier that if Napoleon tripped, he'd probably fall into a different time zone. And here's the quirky tidbit of the day. Rumour has it that Napoleon could fall asleep at will, literally within minutes, to save time. He called it napping like a lion, and some claimed he trained himself to drift off while sitting upright on horseback. You've tried it. You nearly fell off a cart. But to Napoleon, time wasn't just about efficiency. It was about dominance. Wars were won in the gaps, the delays, the moments the enemy wasn't ready. He famously pounced when his opponents were still eating breakfast or resaddling horses. Timing was everything. You remember one chaotic morning when orders came down with minute-by-minute instructions. When to eat, when to load rifles, when to march, when to breathe. Okay, maybe not that one, but close. You and your squad were sprinting to keep up with a schedule drawn by a man who'd been awake since 3 a.m., sipping coffee so thick it could patch a boat hull. Speaking of coffee, did you know he drank his black, bitter, and preferably boiling? You've seen him down an entire pot before a battle, then throw the cup aside like a dramatic poet. Once, during a lull at Wagram, he offered you a sip from his personal thermos. You took it. You regretted it. Your mouth still hasn't forgiven you. Time wasn't just a weapon for Napoleon, it was a religion. And your role, faithful follower, you learned to measure your days not in sunlight, but in bells, watch hands, and the general's pacing. You could guess the hour based on how far he'd walked, how fast he was writing letters, how many aides were sweating nearby. The man had tempo like a symphony conductor with a sabre, and if you were late, oof, even by a minute, he noticed. Once, one of the officers arrived 10 minutes behind schedule during a review. Napoleon didn't yell. He didn't need to. He simply said, "If you cannot conquer the clock, how will you conquer men?" Brutal, but also kind of inspiring. You start waking earlier. You fix your broken watch chain with twine and bone. You mark the edge of your coat cuff with ink. 5 lines for each hour of march. You're not just surviving, you're sinking. And it's not just you. The army moves with eerie coordination now. Whole regiments pivot at the same time. Units appear at the right hill at the right moment with almost magical precision. It's like you're inside a giant clock, every soldier a gear. Historians debate whether this precision was what made Napoleon unbeatable, or if it simply masked deeper chaos. But from your place in the ranks, it feels like certainty. Amid the mud and madness, you can point to a ticking object and say, "That's real, that's now." One last strange moment. A courier once rode up in the middle of a march shouting something urgent. Napoleon didn't flinch. He just looked at his watch, nodded and said, "Too late. We've already moved." He hadn't even heard the message yet. You want that kind of confidence, that kind of relationship with time, not as a thing that controls you, but as something you master. So now, every night before you roll into your lice-ridden blanket, you wind your pocket watch. Carefully, lovingly. You press it to your ear, listening to the soft tick like it's a lullaby, written just for survivors. And in the dark, while others snore or mumble in dreams, you feel strangely powerful. Not because you're strong or brave or clean, but because you know exactly what time it is. Your fingers are sticky with sugar again. You should be cleaning your musket or patching your socks, but instead you're fishing one last candied almond out of a linen pouch. It's Napoleon's fault. Sort of. You wouldn't have even known about these absurd little luxuries if not for him and his maddening habit of snacking during battles. Yes, while you're eating grey bread so hard it could double as a throwing weapon, the man leading the world's most terrifying army is calmly nibbling dragées, sugar-coated almonds, in the middle of a cavalry charge. It's not just a treat, it's a ritual. Napoleon didn't eat much, especially during military campaigns. He'd go the entire day with barely a meal, just sips of wine and bites of something sweet. But he always had something in his coat. A handful of candy, a square of chocolate, dried fruit. One time, you heard he carried a small flask of orange blossom syrup to flavour his water. You tried replicating it with a rotten orange peel and mud. It did not go well. Historians still argue whether his bizarre eating habits were a symptom of his notoriously delicate stomach, or a way to maintain control over his body when everything else was chaos. Maybe both. He could go from pacing like a madman to chewing calmly, one sugared almond at a time, as if he were waiting for the opera to start. Not for cannonballs to start falling, but snacks are just the start, because tucked next to that linen pouch in your coat is something far stranger. A tooth. A molar, yellowed with age, encased in a tiny silver frame. Not your tooth. Not even one you found. It's a replica of Napoleon's own lucky tooth, or so the black market peddler in Bavaria claimed. You don't believe it's real, but you carry it anyway, because everyone knows the stories. The little talismans Napoleon kept hidden in his pockets and waistcoats, a cameo of his mother, a fragment of St. Helena rock long before he'd ever step foot on that island, a miniature dice carved from ivory, tiny tokens all charged with meaning, all pulled out in moments of doubt. There's a famous story, probably made up, about how he once lost his temper during a military briefing, then suddenly reached into his pocket, pulled out a tiny seashell from Corsica, and calmed down instantly. Just stood there, turning it over in his palm. That's the thing with Napoleon. Even his meltdowns were theatrical. And then there were the notes. You've heard the whispers, tiny scraps of coded paper he kept close, stuff even his aides weren't allowed to see. Sometimes written in cipher, sometimes in his own sideways chicken scratch. Love notes from Josephine, tactical memos, lists of enemies. No one knows for sure. One rainy night before Leipzig, you swear you saw him take out a note, read it under a flickering candle, then burn it with the same flame. You weren't supposed to be watching, but your eyes had nowhere else to go. His face was still, not sad, not angry, just distant, like time folded over itself and he was somewhere else entirely. Fringe fact of the night. Some soldiers believed that if you carried an item Napoleon had touched, even briefly, you'd never fall in battle. A piece of cloth, a spent quill, a discarded glove. There were entire side hustles built around collecting and faking these relics. That Napoleon's hair you bought last month? Almost definitely horse bristle. Still, you keep it. Because when the sky turns gunmetal grey and the thunder of war begins again, you'll take anything. A trinket, a tooth, a scrap of paper pressed into your hand by a man with a stare that could melt marble. The weirdest item you've heard of. A soldier who swore he had a button from Napoleon's personal greatcoat, stolen during a drunken scuffle near Vienna. He kept it sewn into the lining of his hat. Licked it before every battle. Got promoted. Coincidence? Possibly. Probably. But try convincing that guy. Even you have your habits now. A little lace ribbon you found in a ruined manor. A rock shaped vaguely like Corsica. An acorn from the forest outside Ulm that you named Marshall Crumbles. You're not proud of that one, but these aren't just lucky charms, they're anchors. In a world where you could be blown to pieces by breakfast, they help you feel tethered to something real. To home, to hope, to the idea that maybe, just maybe, you matter. One dawn, as the drums start and the lines form, you stand next to a man who has a rosary wrapped around his trigger finger. Another with a coin between his teeth. And you press the almond pouch to your lips like a kiss, whisper something to the fake molar, and step into position. Napoleon walks past on horseback, cloak billowing, eyes like iron. He looks calm, focused. You wonder what he has in his pockets today. Another note? A vial of Cologne? That weird dried rose he's been seen sniffing when he thinks no one's looking. Historians debate whether these personal objects were signs of weakness or genius, emotional crutches, or brilliant psychological armour. You don't care. You're just glad you have something small and sweet to suck on while the world explodes around you. It starts with a sock, a single, balled-up, semi-crusty sock that you forgot to hide before inspection. One moment, you're daydreaming about bread that doesn't taste like regret, and the next, Napoleon himself is holding your sock between two fingers, like it's a live grenade. He says nothing, just raises one eyebrow. You die a little inside. Because here's the thing no one warns you about when joining the Grand Army. Napoleon has a vendetta against laundry. Not just unclean clothes, but rumpled collars, mismatched buttons, mud on boots, wrinkled breeches, even the tragic sight of your battle-worn undergarments flapping sadly on the line. To him, it's not just about discipline, it's about presentation. Clean troops are effective troops, or at the very least, less depressing to look at. He expects you to look like you're attending a salon, even when you're in a trench. Historians still argue whether this obsession came from his early life at military school, where appearances meant everything, or whether it developed later as part of his cult of image. Maybe it's both. He was mocked for years as the little corporal, and now he refuses to let his empire look, well, little, unkempt, inferior, like it can't afford a bar of soap. And speaking of soap, he imported his. Special olive oil soap from Marseille, wrapped in linen and stamped with his initials. You once got a whiff of it during a logistics inspection and almost passed out from citrus overload. Smelled like someone trying to erase a battlefield with lemons. He once told his valet that soldiers who looked good fought better. Hard to believe when your leg's numb from frostbite and you haven't washed your armpits since September, but somehow it sticks. You start to care. Just a little. You notice it in the details. You spend an extra 5 minutes scraping your boots with a stick. You learn how to iron a cravat on a hot rock. You sew that one button back on. Slowly, your squad starts to look less like a parade of swamp ghouls and more like something approaching a military force. And then there's the linen inspections. Oh yes, Napoleon is famous for reviewing troops mid-campaign, not just for formation or firepower, but for cleanliness. He'll ride along a line of soldiers, lean in, and tug at someone's sleeve. If there's grime or lint, expect a disapproving snort. You remember one poor soul near Dresden, fresh from a skirmish, face bleeding, coat torn in two. Napoleon rides by, glances at the man's muddy collar and says, "You look like a peasant who's lost his mule," then trots away like he didn't just emotionally detonate an entire person. And still, we try. Because somewhere deep inside, you know what he's doing. He's holding the army to a higher standard. He's demanding dignity, even in the most undignified conditions. And maybe, just maybe, he believes if you dress like a victor, you become one. Fringe fact, Napoleon actually funded mobile laundries for his campaigns. Entire wagons of washerwomen who followed the army, scrubbing and boiling garments in giant cauldrons on wheels. It sounds luxurious until you realise those same cauldrons were sometimes repurposed for soup. Yes, that mystery stew you had in Bavaria. Best not to ask which came first, socks or carrots. There's even an apocryphal tale of Napoleon halting an entire column to berate a general whose trousers were too dusty. You've no idea if it's true, but it feels true. The man once dismissed an aide for delivering a message with ink stains on his fingers. He did, however, allow for practical variations. You once got creative and lined your boots with wool from a discarded sheepskin. When he asked about the lumpy shape, you braced for doom. But instead, he nodded and said, "Adaptation." Good. Then rode off. You didn't walk for 2 days, but your pride floated on air. And then there are the white gloves. Napoleon loved them, always wore pristine pairs during formal events, and often during battle. You've seen him hand them off to valets mid-stride, swapping one pair for another like he's hosting a scented garden party rather than an artillery barrage. He didn't like seeing gloves dirtied. They were a symbol, a signal, and you suspect he thought the same about all of us. That we were symbols too. That every neatly folded sleeve, every brushed boot, every laundered sash whispered something to the world. We are not broken. We may be tired, hungry, and ankle-deep in other people's regrets, but we still wear clean shirts. So you start tucking a spare tunic into your satchel. You make time to wipe mud off your coat with cold river water. You stitch your torn cuffs with thread from an abandoned parasol. You even find an old perfume bottle near an Austrian carriage wreck. It's mostly empty, but on days when everything feels like ash, you shake out a drop and dab it behind your ears like some battlefield debutante. Historians will never fully agree whether Napoleon's obsession with laundry was genius, madness, or just the 19th century version of look good, feel good. But you start to understand it. Because when you stand in formation, teeth chattering, nerves fried, and Napoleon rides past, you want to be one of the soldiers he nods at, the clean ones, the prepared ones, the ones who still care. And hey, maybe your sock still has a hole, maybe your shirt smells like defeat, but your buttons are polished, your boots are dry, and you're ready, not just to fight, but to represent something bigger than survival, even if that something is just slightly less filthy than the other guy. It's crooked again. Not by accident, never by accident. You tilt your hat just a hair to the left, mimicking the angle you saw Napoleon wear during the last parade march. The brim cuts across your forehead at a rakish diagonal, catching the wind in just the right dramatic flourish. You can't see your reflection, but you feel like you look confident. Or deranged. Hard to say with these wool monstrosities. Because in Napoleon's army, your hat is more than just a hat. It's a signal, a statement, a battlefield billboard perched on your dome. Napoleon's own bicorn, a black, broad, crescent-shaped number, was famously worn sideways, the 2 points stretched ear to ear. Almost everyone else in Europe wore it front to back, like a squishy sandwich roll, but not him, never him. And that wasn't a mistake or a fashion quirk. It was branding. He wore it that way so that, even from a distance in a storm of movement and noise, his silhouette stood out. Troops could see him through cannon smoke, through dust, through crowds of similarly dressed officers. He was the sideways guy on the horse, easy to spot, impossible to miss. Historians still argue whether this iconic tilt was about strategy or ego. Probably both, but the result was genius. He turned himself into a symbol as recognizable as a flag. One look at that hat angle and boom, you knew. That's him. That's our guy. You started adjusting your own hat like that weeks ago. At first you got weird looks, a few snickers. One guy called you Little Napoleon for 3 days straight. But slowly the trend spread. Now half your regiment is rocking that same crooked look. It feels a bit silly, but also united. You're part of something. And let's be honest, most of your uniform has seen better days. Your buttons are mismatched, your sash is fraying, and you had to repair your left boot with melted candle wax and desperate hope. So if you can't look sharp from the neck down, at least you can make a statement above the eyebrows. The thing is, Napoleon didn't just wear one hat. He had dozens. Some say over 120 bicorns during his reign, all made by the same Parisian hatmaker. But they were all the same type. Unadorned, simple, functional. No feathers, no fluff. He wanted his soldiers to look at him and see efficiency, power, not some glittering peacock with a velvet plume. That's part of the mystery. Napoleon wasn't extravagant in the ways you'd expect a self-crowned emperor to be. No gold thread on his hats, no ridiculous insignias. He wanted to stand out, not show off. There's this great story, okay, maybe legend, where a tailor once offered to embroider his hat with a laurel wreath in real gold thread. Napoleon apparently scoffed and said, "Do you want me to blind my enemies or defeat them?" He was sarcastic like that. But don't let the simplicity fool you. He was obsessive about the details. His hats were shaped just so, with a slight forward droop on the brim that gave his profile that signature menacing look. He had them steamed and brushed daily, and he always wore them at the same angle. Precision, again, even in accessories. And here's a quirky tidbit. One of his hats sold in the 21st century for nearly $2 million. Someone bought a worn, sweat-stained wool hat from 200 years ago, simply because it sat on that head. Probably doesn't smell like cologne anymore. Now, back to you. You find yourself spending more and more time on your own hat. You brush it with a horsehair mitten. You patch the inside lining with silk from a torn sleeve. You even invent a little ritual before each battle. Tilt, tug, adjust, deep breath. It's not armor, but it feels like protection. A mask. A version of yourself you want to be. And then, one day, you notice something. When Napoleon rides past and sees soldiers with their hats tilted just like his, he smirks. Barely. A twitch. But it's there. Approval. You can feel it, like a general who's created 50,000 miniatures of himself and is proud of each silly little clone. But this goes deeper than mimicry. The hat is communication. Symbolism. You're telling the enemy, we're organized, we're disciplined, and yeah, we've got style. There's even a bit of psychology to it. Think about it. When you're terrified, the last thing you want to do is look disheveled and weak. But put on a crisp hat, adjust it just so, and suddenly, you're not just a terrified farm kid holding a bayonet. You're part of an empire. Historians debate how much of Napoleon's power came from raw military genius and how much came from sheer presentation. But when you're standing shoulder to shoulder in a freezing field and everyone's hat is tilted like some strange, ominous crescent moon, you feel it. You look like a unit, You look like a legend. And, yeah, maybe your hat smells like goat and regret, but it's tilted just right. It matters. So tomorrow morning, when the wind howls and the horses snort steam into the sky, you'll reach up, fix your brim to that perfect angle, and take your place in line. Not because it keeps your head warm, but because he does it. And sometimes looking like you belong is half the battle. It's another letter day. That sacred, strange rhythm in the camp, where even hardened veterans get quiet and pretend not to hover too close to the courier wagons. You're standing in the mud, trying not to look desperate, when someone finally calls your name. A folded scrap of parchment sealed in wax, still smelling faintly of rosewater. Your hands shake just a little. You know what's coming. Because in Napoleon's army, letters are currency, emotion, survival. You're not alone in this. Every man around you clutches a message like it's treasure. Some read aloud, some weep quietly. One guy sniffs his envelope, murmuring "Serene" like she's a goddess who lives inside the paper. And somewhere, maybe just beyond the tents, Napoleon is doing the exact same thing, only his letters are from Josephine. He writes to her constantly, obsessively, in the middle of campaigns, just hours after major battles, when he should probably be eating or sleeping or just a thought planning for the next day. Instead, he's pouring his guts onto paper, signing off with lines like, "I ache to be near you, to kiss you, to smell you." Yeah. Your commander-in-chief writes full-on thirst mail between artillery volleys. Historians still argue whether these letters reveal the real Napoleon, a romantic, sentimental softy, or if they were performative, part of a grand emotional campaign. But the fact is, they're real. Dozens of them. Torn, ink-stained, and still here centuries later, whispering from archives like echoes from an emperor's diary. You've seen him write them, sitting hunched over a camp table surrounded by maps and generals, while his quill scratches furiously across thin paper. Everyone else stands back. They know this isn't a moment to interrupt. Once you watched him burn one. No one said a word. The smoke curled like incense, and his face was unreadable. But it's not just Josephine. He writes letters constantly, to his brothers, to his ministers, to foreign leaders, even to random citizens whose names you'll never remember. Thousands upon thousands of letters, all micromanaging, cajoling, seducing, threatening. You sometimes wonder if he even sleeps. You suspect not. And yes, he reads what you write too. At least, his bureaucratic monster of an intelligence network does. The army censors screen letters in and out, watching for desertion talk, morale shifts, or coded warnings. You once saw a guy get questioned for writing, "The food's killing me." Turned out he meant indigestion. Still got kitchen duty for a week. But beneath the surveillance, the suspicion, there's something raw and very human here. Because even the men who can't read or write, they try. They dictate letters to their literate bunkmates, pay scribes with crusts of bread. Everyone wants someone back home to know they're still alive. You carry 2 letters of your own now. One from your sister, written in smeared charcoal on butcher paper. One from a woman you don't even remember very well, but whose handwriting is the neatest thing you've seen in months. You fold them carefully every night, touch them before sleep. And then there's the lint. Oh, the lint. Because if you think Napoleon only notices uniforms, boots, or collars, think again. He's been known to pluck lint off his soldiers. Personally, you've seen him do it with all the flair of a disappointed aunt. He once walked up to an artillery sergeant, said nothing, pulled a speck of fuzz from his lapel, flicked it away, and kept walking. There's something terrifying about that level of attention, but it's also kind of weirdly intimate. The man who commands a continent also notices that you've got hay stuck to your cuff. He expects you to iron your socks with your imagination, write poetry to your wife, and simultaneously fire a cannon while looking emotionally balanced and lint-free. Fringe fact. One of Napoleon's valets kept a secret lint journal recording the emperor's lint-picking incidents. Most of it's lost, but you've heard the story. In it, Napoleon once stopped mid-campaign to complain that his personal guard's cloaks were attracting too much field fluff. He gave a full speech, in front of enemy lines. And then there are the emotional breakdowns, because no one talks about this, but Napoleon, he cried. Often, he broke furniture, he threw pens. Once flung a candle across the room because a letter didn't arrive. The man had the emotional range of a Shakespeare protagonist and the sleep schedule of a haunted squirrel. You saw it firsthand outside Smolensk. The mood was grim. Supplies were low. One of his messengers delivered bad news. His brother had ignored an order again. Napoleon stood in silence for a full minute, then suddenly slammed his fists onto the table, knocking over a bottle of cologne which shattered on the floor. The scent of citrus and rage hung in the air for hours. Historians debate whether these moments were carefully staged, part of his manipulation playbook, or just genuine flashes of a man cracking under the weight of history. Maybe it's both. Maybe the only way to rule Europe is to feel everything too much. And maybe, just maybe, that's why his letters mattered so much. Why he held onto notes like lifelines, why you do the same. You run your fingers over the soft paper, still folded, still legible, still yours. In a world full of cannonballs, marching orders, and imperial egos, it's the smallest thing. Words, ink, a remembered name, that keeps you you. So when dusk settles over the camp, and the cookpot smells suspiciously like old socks, you sit by a cold lantern and reread that same letter for the 10th time. Outside, someone sings, someone snores. Somewhere, Napoleon is writing another page with shaking hands. And maybe, under all that power and posture and perfume, he's just another man trying to hold on to love in a world built to shatter it. The sea air smells like salt and melancholy. You're not used to this kind of quiet, this damp, endless hush broken only by waves and the distant cry of gulls. The battle drums are silent now. The letters are fewer. The uniforms a bit faded, more grey than blue. You're on St. Helena, the place they send people when they want them remembered but not seen. Napoleon's empire is gone. But the cologne, still here, still in his coat, still dabbed carefully behind each ear every morning, even in exile, even now. It's almost funny. You'd expect an ex-emperor to let himself go a little. You know, stop shaving, mumble to seagulls, maybe finally embrace the life of a dishevelled beach hermit. But no, he still wakes early, still dresses precisely, still commands his shrinking world like it's the centre of the universe. And every morning he opens that same slim bottle, Eau de Cologne 4711. He pours a little too much, rubs it into his hands, breathes deeply like he's inhaling old victories. The man is living in a glorified prison with a leaky roof, surrounded by guards, headaches and English passive aggression, and yet his first act each day is to smell exactly like he did at Austerlitz. Historians still argue whether this habit, this stubborn devotion to routine, was a sign of resilience or a refusal to let go. But from where you sit, half listening to the wind rattle shutters, it feels like both, a dying empire in a bottle. You're not technically a soldier anymore. You're part of his household, one of the loyal few who stayed with him. The world has moved on. France is under new management. Napoleon is no longer a general or a consul or an emperor. He's just a man with a memory problem. Not that he forgets things. He remembers too well. He paces for hours, reliving every battle, every betrayal, every treaty signed and torn. You've heard the same stories so many times you could mouth the words alongside him. But you don't, because sometimes a man needs to narrate his life just to convince himself it happened. He still carries his watch, though he barely trusts time anymore. He says it moves differently on this island, slower, meaner. You once caught him talking to his hat. Not out loud, but gently, almost fondly, like a father straightening a child's collar. He still insists on the sideways angle when he wears it, though now there's no one left to notice. No battlefield crowd, no line of soldiers craning their necks to follow that distinctive silhouette. Only the wind. The routines continue. Clean shirts, folded gloves, boots polished so fiercely you can see your own weary face in them. He dictates letters, to no one mostly. Some he never sends, just folds and tucks into a box like he's filing away his former self. And the cologne, it runs low. He writes for more, pleads even. One bottle arrives, months late. He clutches it like a relic, opens it reverently, and places it on his desk like a medal from a war that hasn't happened. You remember a day when the bottle slipped, shattered on the stone floor. He froze. You knelt to clean it up, but he stopped you, just stood there, letting the smell rise in waves, sharp citrus, soft rosemary, fading into lavender. For once he didn't bark or scowl. He looked tired, like a man out of time, still dressed for a parade that no longer exists. Fringe fact, Napoleon's body, after his death, was said to be remarkably preserved. Some whispered it was due to the cologne. Others said it was the island air. But you like to imagine it was the sheer force of will, that even in death the man refused to be anything less than intact. He died surrounded by a few books, a sword, and a lock of Josephine's hair. Still writing, still dictating, still trying to shape the narrative. And when he went, you swear you could smell the cologne, faint but real, as if it had sunk into the walls, into the wood, into history itself. Now, years later, when people ask what he was like, not the emperor but the man, you tell them this: he cared about buttons, he cried over letters, he believed in silk shirts and sideways hats, and sugar almonds and pocket watches and clean boots, even when the world was burning down. And above all else, he never stopped wanting to smell good, because maybe he knew something the rest of us are still trying to learn, that even when your empire crumbles and your name is dragged through newspapers and your enemies toast to your downfall, you are still you, a person with rituals and pride and strange little habits that make no military sense but feel like magic anyway. So if you ever find yourself on your own St. Helena, trapped, forgotten, surrounded by grey, dab on a little scent, straighten your collar, tilt your hat just a little, and remind the universe who you were. Now, everything slows, the battlefield fades, the scent of citrus and smoke drifts into memory, the boots come off, the silk shirt lies folded by the bed, and somewhere the steady tick of a pocket watch marks the hush of twilight. You feel your shoulders relax, the tent flaps still, the wind softens, the drums are silent, replaced by the quiet rhythm of breath. Yours, steady, gentle, safe. There's no empire to win tonight, no map to redraw. Just this moment, simple and still. You picture the cologne bottle on a dusty desk, catching the last golden thread of sunset. The scent lingers, not loud or proud now, but subtle, familiar, like the echo of a lullaby. You remember that almond tucked in your pocket, the letter folded just so, the lint picked off your sleeve by a man who once ruled the world. And you smile, because even among emperors, among history's giants, it's the small things that last, the quiet rituals, the way we carry ourselves when no one's watching, the way we keep showing up, clean shirt or not, ready for whatever comes next. So close your eyes. Let the images drift, hats in the wind, boots on soft grass, candlelight flickering on brass buttons. Let the noise dissolve. Let sleep tiptoe in like a messenger, bearing peace instead of orders. You've marched far enough for one night. You're safe now. You're home.